we must stop those countries that count their wealth and their assets in terms of the minerals that reside in the African soil.
In breaking news, the ongoing tensions between South Africa and the US have now surged to boiling point. Washington has threatened consequences over what it deems as slights against its officials. It's accusing Pretoria of blocking its officials from rendering aid to Afrikaners. The US says, quote, it will not tolerate such behavior. The row follows a raid on a non-governmental US refugee processing center in Johannesburg earlier this week. 7 Kenyans have since been deported for working at the center illegally. They did not have work permits.
Well, we've had discussions about the stoppage of funding, and it is entirely within their own right. I mean, it is their money. And in many ways, it's a wake-up call on our part as South Africans that we've got to find ways of being self-reliant, of relying on our own resources, and that is what our people expect.
This wasn't announced with sirens or speeches. There was no dramatic press conference, but within government offices and corporate boardrooms, the message landed hard. A major US company was told its time in South Africa was over, not because of bankruptcy, not because of sanctions, but because the rules had changed and Washington wasn't prepared for how decisively Pretoria would enforce them. For years, American companies assumed strategic importance guaranteed protection. This move shattered that assumption, and it revealed something much bigger. South Africa is no longer managing relations around US approval. This wasn't an isolated decision, it was a signal. And it marked a turning point in how power is being negotiated quietly, firmly, and without permission. For decades, US companies operating abroad followed an unspoken rule. If the investment was large enough and the political ties were strong enough, governments would adapt. South Africa was no exception. American firms entered the country during its post-apartheid reintegration into the global economy, positioning themselves as partners in growth, development, and modernization. These companies didn't just bring capital, they brought branding, leverage, and the assumption that their presence aligned with Western diplomatic priorities. Over time, that assumption hardened into expectation. But expectations don't survive power shifts. South Africa today is not the South Africa of the early 2000s. Its leadership landscape has changed, its strategic priorities have shifted, and its patience for arrangements that favor foreign corporations over domestic goals has worn thin. The decision to force out a major U.S. company didn't begin overnight, it was the end of a long recalculation. At the center of that recalculation was a question South African policymakers had begun asking more openly: who actually benefits from these partnerships? For years, officials tolerated asymmetries in exchange for stability, investment flows, and diplomatic cover. But global conditions changed, supply chains fractured, energy politics intensified, strategic resources became bargaining chips rather than commodities, and South Africa found itself holding more leverage than it once believed. The U.S. company at the center of this moment was deeply embedded: infrastructure, contracts, market share, influence. This wasn't a marginal player, which is exactly why the decision mattered. Removing a small firm would have gone unnoticed. Removing a major American entity sent a message that couldn't be ignored. What made the move especially striking was how procedural it appeared on the surface. No emotional rhetoric, no public confrontation, just regulatory enforcement, licenses reviewed, compliance standards reassessed, national interest clauses invoked. By the time the company understood what was happening, the outcome was already set. This is how modern power is exercised, not with spectacle, but with structure. From Washington's perspective, the shock wasn't just the removal. It was the realization that influence had failed quietly. Calls were made, diplomatic channels activated, concerns were raised, but the response from Pretoria was restrained and firm. The rules applied equally. Domestic priorities came first. The decision stood that restraint mattered. It stripped the situation of drama and left only substance, and in that substance was a reality many policymakers had underestimated. South Africa no longer defines sovereignty defensively, it defines it operationally. This moment didn't emerge in isolation. It came after years of mounting tension around industrial policy, localization requirements, and strategic autonomy. South Africa had been signaling its direction through legislation, trade alignments, and foreign policy votes. BRICS was not a slogan, it was a framework, and within that framework, dependence on any single external power became a liability. What Washington failed to account for was timing. This decision came at a moment when the US was already stretched diplomatically, trade disputes, energy transitions, strategic competition elsewhere. The assumption was that no ally or partner would introduce friction voluntarily. South Africa did, and it did so precisely because the cost-benefit calculation had changed. Global competition for access, markets, and partnerships meant Pretoria was no longer negotiating from a position of scarcity. Alternatives existed, options expanded, and leverage quietly accumulated. The removal of a U.S. company was not a rejection of American business as a whole. It was a rejection of outdated leverage dynamics. That distinction is critical. South Africa isn't closing its doors, it's tightening terms, and tightening terms is what comes after confidence replaces caution. For American corporations watching from afar, the message was unsettling. For other governments, it was clarifying. If a country like South Africa, historically careful in balancing global relationships, was willing to absorb the fallout, then the old playbook was clearly obsolete. This wasn't about punishment, it was about repositioning. The bigger question now wasn't why the company was forced out, but why it was assumed it never could be. That assumption reflected a world that no longer exists. As power diffuses and partnerships diversify, governments are less inclined to trade sovereignty for stability. They are more willing to accept short-term friction for long-term control. And once that threshold is crossed, decisions that once seemed unthinkable become executable. South Africa crossed that threshold quietly. What comes next isn't escalation, it's normalization. Other deals will be reviewed, other contracts reconsidered, other assumptions tested, not out of hostility, but out of recalibration. And that's what makes this moment larger than one company, one country, or one headline. It signals that the era of automatic deference is ending. What made South Africa's decision so consequential wasn't the removal of a single U.S. company. It was what the decision revealed about how the global system is quietly reorganizing. For decades, U.S. economic influence rested on three assumptions. First, that access to American capital was irreplaceable. Second, that political alignment guaranteed corporate security abroad. Third, that no serious partner would risk alienating Washington without extraordinary pressure. All three assumptions are weakening at the same time. South Africa didn't act recklessly, it acted strategically, in a world where leverage no longer flows in one direction. The global economy today is not defined by loyalty blocks, it's defined by optionality. Countries that once had to choose sides now choose terms, and those terms increasingly favor sovereignty, diversification, and long-term control over short-term accommodation. This is where the U.S. miscalculated. American policymakers still tend to view influence through presence: how many companies operate, how much capital is deployed, how deeply integrated firms are into local markets. But influence today is less about presence and more about replaceability. South Africa calculated that the company being removed was replaceable. Not immediately, not without friction, but within a framework where alternatives existed, whether from domestic players, regional partners, or non-Western investors. That calculation marks a decisive psychological shift. Once a government believes it can absorb retaliation, manage disruption, and maintain growth without Western approval, the leverage equation collapses. That's when enforcement becomes possible. And enforcement is exactly what happened. Behind the scenes, this moment had been building for years. South Africa has been revising its approach to industrial policy, resource management, and strategic sectors. The emphasis has moved steadily toward localization, technology transfer, and domestic value creation. Foreign companies were not excluded, but they were placed under new expectations: adapt or exit. Many adjusted, some resisted, one crossed the line. From Washington's vantage point, the removal felt sudden. From Pretoria's perspective, it was overdue. What made the fallout even more unsettling for U.S. strategists was the lack of international backlash. Markets didn't panic, allies didn't condemn, multilateral institutions remained neutral. There was no coalition response. That silence spoke volumes. It signaled that South Africa's decision fit within an emerging global norm, states asserting regulatory authority even when it inconveniences powerful partners. This is the same dynamic reshaping trade, energy, and finance. Countries are no longer willing to trade strategic autonomy for access alone. Access is no longer scarce. Capital is no longer exclusive. Partnerships are increasingly interchangeable. And that's where BRICS becomes relevant, not as an anti-Western bloc, but as a structural buffer. South Africa's alignment within BRICS didn't trigger this decision, but it insulated it. BRICS offered alternative financing channels, alternative trade frameworks, alternative political legitimacy. That meant South Africa didn't need to frame its move as defiance, it could frame it as governance. And governance is harder to challenge than confrontation. The United States, meanwhile, faces a harder reality. When a U.S. company is removed from a market like South Africa, it's not just about lost revenue, it's about precedent. Other governments watch closely. They analyze the response, they study the costs. If the cost is manageable, confidence spreads. This is how power erodes not through collapse but through replication. Across the global south, governments are re-evaluating old agreements signed under very different conditions. Contracts negotiated during times of financial pressure are being scrutinized under new strategic priorities. Energy assets, telecommunications, mining, infrastructure. Sectors once considered untouchable are now being reassessed. And the message from South Africa is clear: no company is too important to regulate. That message lands uncomfortably in Washington because it collides with domestic realities. The U.S. is already struggling to maintain consensus on foreign policy priorities. Corporate diplomacy is harder to coordinate. Retaliation carries costs at home. Sanctions, risk backlash, trade pressure, fuel inflation, diplomatic escalation, strain other negotiations. South Africa understood this calculus. It understood that enforcement, executed quietly and legally, would generate less resistance than confrontation, and it understood that the U.S. response would be constrained by competing interests elsewhere. This wasn't a gamble. It was a measured move. What makes this moment especially important is that it wasn't driven by ideology. It was driven by leverage assessment. South Africa didn't turn against the U.S., it simply concluded that the relationship had to be rebalanced, and that rebalance required action, not rhetoric. That distinction matters because it makes reversal unlikely. Once a government asserts authority successfully, backing down signals weakness, and weakness, in a competitive global environment, is costly, so the move stands. Domestic capacity building, technology transfer, sovereign control of critical sectors. These are no longer slogans, they are conditions. The broader consequence is that the architecture of global business is fragmenting, not breaking, but reconfiguring. Companies can no longer assume uniform rules across regions. They must navigate differentiated sovereignty, and differentiated sovereignty favors states willing to enforce it. South Africa has demonstrated that it is. What happens next is not a cascade of expulsions but a recalibration of power. Companies will renegotiate, governments will assert, partnerships will be redefined, and Washington will face a difficult adjustment. Influence must be earned through alignment, not assumed through history. The removal of one U.S. company didn't end American presence in South Africa, but it ended something more important. It ended the belief that presence alone guarantees permanence, and once that belief disappears, the balance of global economic power shifts quietly, structurally, and irreversibly.